Hey, welcome everyone. I think we have a fun one for you today. I'm addressing a topic that seems to be popular in conversation these days, and that's this question: are oil prices higher when a Democrat's in the White House or a Republican? Now, I was talking with somebody recently who made some pretty bold statements about this, and it piqued my interest enough that I thought I'd dig in. And what I found were not only some interesting facts, but also what I think were counterintuitive facts. So that's what we're talking about today, and let's get into it. First of all, just real briefly, I'm Ted Erhart. My professional focus is retirement planning and investment management for individuals over 55. I like to talk about those types of topics, but in addition, I also have just a deep curiosity around financial markets. I like to invest personally and talk about things all economic related and so forth. And that's exactly what we're doing today, talking about oil prices. So with that being said, let's get into it. Now, before we go super deep here, I do want to say that although my goal is to be as fact-based as possible, I only have so much time. So if you want to quibble with the data I'm using or some of the crude inflation adjustments I'm making, I'm going to say give me a break because I have a full-time job and 2 kids under 6. So with that being said, let's jump in. So let me start by mentioning that the data we're basing this discussion off is the global benchmark for crude oil, which is known as Brent. And I'm using this not only because it's a good benchmark, but honestly, it's the most complete data set that I had quick and easy access to. Now, my data goes back to the late 1980s, so we're limiting the scope of our analysis to the last 6 presidents, beginning with George H.W. Bush. Now, before we get into this comparison, a few things need to be said. First and foremost, and we're going to see more of this towards the end, I think any rational person would accept the fact that other factors or forces probably have a lot more to do with the fluctuation in oil prices than who's sitting in the White House. But like I said, we'll look at more of that in a couple minutes. Additionally, there's some challenges with this comparison because we're looking at 6 presidents, 2 of which were one-term presidents, and the third, the current president, hasn't even been in office for 2 years. So there's some issues there. Additionally, there's the issue of inflation, of course. And I am going to make a few adjustments for that, which we'll look at in a moment. And then finally, there's just the issue of what is or are the best statistics to compare. So for example, oil prices actually touched their all-time highs in the summer of 2008, actually on both a nominal and an inflation-adjusted basis. At that point in time, George W. Bush happened to be president. So should George W. Bush be the biggest loser in our analysis, or should we be comparing something else? Now, I think it's obvious a better statistic to compare would be the average price of crude during a respective presidency. And here are those averages. But wait, if you're saying, yeah, but what about inflation? Well, here's a rough adjustment for inflation. And to be clear, I simply took the averages and adjusted them as of the last full year a president was in office. And this is one of those give me a break moments because I didn't want to spend all day adjusting all the individual data points and then figuring out that average. So it's not perfect, but it gives you a sense of how the figures change. And frankly, they don't change that much. Now, this brings us to the first point that I really found interesting and somewhat counterintuitive. There's this common narrative that oil prices are always lower under a Republican president because Republicans tend to be friendlier to the oil and gas industry. Now, on the one hand, it's true that Barack Obama had the highest average prices during his presidency. Ironically, Bill Clinton, obviously also a Democrat, had the lowest prices across this data set that we're looking at. And I'll show you this in the other charts as well. Here's the nominal price averages, that is, through the different presidencies. And here's the inflation adjusted. What's also kind of counterintuitive, which I alluded to already, George W. Bush obviously was a Republican president, but in addition, he was from Texas, so kind of you would think the ultimate oil and gas guy. But when you look at the chart during his presidency, it's kind of mind-blowing. It's very counterintuitive to the narrative that is so prevalent in this kind of popular conversation. So additionally, if there's one major takeaway from these charts, it's the fact that oil prices are just incredibly volatile, and they really show no discernible trend across the different administrations. And let's just look at 3 presidencies in a row where you can really see some of this volatility. So for example, we've talked about George W. Bush, obviously prices hit their all-time highs, but in his last year in office, prices suddenly dropped something like 80% over the course of just 6 months. So, likewise, Barack Obama obviously took office after Bush. Prices trended up. They basically plateaued in the middle part of his 2 terms. But then suddenly, towards the end of his presidency, in the last 2 or 3 years, prices suddenly dropped. Much like George W. Bush, they were down something like 75% peak to trough. And last but not least, I'll just mention Donald Trump. Obviously, we see prices went up, and then we just see this massive crash. And my question to you is to think about when you look at these charts. I mean, do you really think presidents 1 year are responsible for these massive booms or explosion in prices, and then the next year they're responsible for these total collapses? Well, obviously the answer is of course not. Other forces are at play. Now remember, oil is a pure commodity, and classically what drives the price of commodities, especially at the extremes, is just supply and demand. And frankly, I've always been fascinated about how delicate that balance really is. You know, if supply exceeds demand, well, that means at some point that things are just piling up in warehouses somewhere and prices ultimately collapse. And on the flip side, obviously, if supply is constrained, either prices skyrocket or the shelves empty out. I remember pretty vividly at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, when for whatever reason, people thought they needed to stock up on toilet paper and the shelves emptied out. I mean, it took months. I think it might have taken a year at least for that market to normalize. Again, it's amazing how delicate that balance is. Now, what's further interesting about commodities that trade on the open market like oil is you can just vividly see the supply and demand disruptions show up in these price swings. And as illustrated here, one can see these especially at the extremes. There's virtually always some macroeconomic force or geopolitical event that's responsible for the big movement in price. So, are oil prices higher when a Democrat or a Republican is in the White House? Well, as you can see, it really isn't clear-cut. If we go back and reference our inflation-adjusted table, it's true on the one hand that of the last 6 presidents, oil prices were the highest on average when a Democrat was in the White House during Barack Obama's presidency. But it's also true that oil prices were the lowest when a Democrat was in the White House during Bill Clinton's presidency. If we look at the 3 lowest averages, which were Clinton, H.W. Bush, and Donald Trump, well, we can see that 2 of the 3 were Republicans. But likewise, as we looked at earlier, oil prices actually reached their all-time high when George W. Bush was in office. So my point is, there's just a lot of contradictory information and data here, and of course that is just ripe for being cherry-picked by partisans. But that being said, let's just go back to the last chart that we looked at, because I think this one is the most interesting and really tells the most complete picture. To me, the conclusion is clear. Who's sitting at the White House at any given time is much less important relative to some of these major macroeconomic forces or geopolitical events that seem to hit every 5 to 10 years. But hey, let me know what you think. In fact, do me a favor before you go. Let me know the most interesting or counterintuitive thing you learned. I learned a whole bunch of stuff, and I thought it was kind of a fascinating discussion and deep dive. But look, hey, I just want to say thanks for watching. I hope we'll see you on the next one.